Hi, I'm Princess Senate, conference producer at Technology Networks, and I am here to introduce our last talk of the day, brought to you by Rebecca Moritz from Colorado State University, presenting The Evolution of the Biosafety Profession, Current State, and Where Do We Go From Here? Rebecca is the Biosafety Director at Colorado State University, and she's also an adjunct faculty member in CSU's Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Pathology. Rebecca received her bachelor's degree in bacteriology and her master's in medical microbiology and immunology from the University of Wisconsin's Madison. Rebecca has chaired the Dual Use Research of Concern Subcommittee, the ICDUR, and served as a lead member of the Biosecurity Task Force, showcasing her dedication to shaping safety protocols and research practices. A warm welcome to you, Rebecca. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. And with that, I will now hand over to Rebecca to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Princess. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry to be standing between you and the rest of your day and your evening. Like Princess said, my name is Rebecca Moritz. Today, I'm actually representing the American Biological Safety Association International, of which I am their immediate past president. So we're going to be really talking about biosafety and kind of the current state of things and what we can anticipate going forwards. So we should really be talking about biosafety and biosecurity and kind of what the differences are between the two before we get going today. So biosafety, the whole point of biosafety is to protect us from pathogens. And when you think about biosecurity, it's thinking about protecting pathogens from us. They use the same principles, practices, and procedures and ideas behind how you mitigate risk. However, they are two very distinct things, even though internationally translation often results in them being seen as more similar things, but they are distinct things. So in the United States, the published history of biosafety is mostly rooted in North America and Western Europe, and it really has actually quite dark origins. Many of the origins of biosafety are tied to the U.S. biological weapons program, which was developed during the Cold War, which started in 1943 at Camp Detrick, which is now known today as Fort Detrick and still exists and does a wide variety of high containment research for the U.S. government. So the first scientific director was actually a man named Ira Baldwin, and he realized immediately that the program really needed to develop some specific measures to protect the program's personnel as well as the surrounding community of Fort Detrick from what they were working with. And the development of these biological weapons required biosafety. So it's really, the U.S. I'm sure is not alone in developing the U.S. was not alone in developing bioweapons programs. There were many countries around the world that did that as well. So it is safe to assume that they also developed biosafety practices, but that information is not necessarily published or is readily available. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see a piece of equipment developed by Newell Johnson, which was basically the original Class 3 biosafety cabinet. And this picture was taken at Fort Detrick, and you see these gentlemen working inside of gloves inside of metal boxes that were containing all of the aerosols that they were potentially working with. So it was realized in the mid-50s that there needed to be these challenges and solutions that they were coming up with for this work really needed to start to be shared and to discuss biosafety annually. So while this program, the Offensive Biological Weapons Program, was terminated in 1969 under President Nixon, these annual meetings continued and eventually led to the formation of the American Biological Safety Association, or as we know it today, ABSA International, which was formed in 1984. And like I said, I am the immediate past president of ABSA and heavily involved in the association. But also at the same time, other people were starting to look at interventions from a biosafety perspective. So the gentleman here on the left, Arnold Weedham, described the first use of mechanical pipetters and how the use of them was actually attached to lab-acquired infections in German literature as far as back as 1907 and 1908. He was the director of health and safety at the U.S. Army Biological Research Lab from 1944 to 1969, and really laid the foundation for evaluating the risks of handling infectious microorganisms and for recognizing that biological hazards and developing practices, equipment, and facility safeguards was really, really essential. So they weren't alone in doing this, but this is some of the more notable people associated with it. So this is a busy slide, but you kind of get the idea of, first we have this work starting that really requires different types of interventions. We have people looking at how are people getting sick from their work. And all of this is starting to coalesce into meetings, sharing knowledge, developing engineering practices, until we start to get to the early 70s and early 80s, where we've got the World Health Organization developing materials, and we have other groups developing materials. We're talking about this concept of risk groups, as well as biosafety levels. So in the 1970s, 1980s, we started to see a lot of definitions, but not necessarily a ton of documents. So in 1974, CDC first released the BMBL, which is now on its 6th edition. And then in 1976, you have the NIH guidelines for research involving recombinant DNA. Fast forward to today, we have a lot more resources, and biosafety has really evolved to focus more on risk-based approaches, with biosecurity also playing a larger role. So like I said, we have the 6th edition of BMBL. You have the Canadian Biosafety Standard. You also have the Canadian Safety Pathogen Safety Data Sheets, which is something I use all the time. It's a wonderful tool to go look up a human pathogen, look at what the risks are for the lab. It's got all of the characteristics in one place. It is an incredibly useful tool. You also have got WHO's 4th edition of the Biosafety Manual. You have ISO standards that have been developed, and we are now on, I don't even know how many generations of the NIH guidelines, which the most recent publication was in 2019. And they're actually in process of issuing a new version soon after some revisions have been made. So again, another busy slide here, but you can see, in the early 2000s, we're dealing with risk groups, we're dealing with biosafety levels. This concept of biorisk management gets introduced. So it's a way, it's kind of one word way to describe the aspects of biosafety and biosecurity. We have a lot more professional associations developing around the world. We have more rules, we have more regulations, we have more guidelines, but it is very different from country to country. It is also very different from institution to institution. Now, the diversity and complexity of institutions is a challenge for everyday biosafety as well as going forward. It is why there are differences between countries and countries, between institution and institution. We all have different availability of resources, and that could be just money, that could be personnel, it could be, personal protective equipment, things like that. We all have different access to things, and our bosses place a different emphasis on supporting that. We also all have differing facilities. There is no necessarily international standard for this is what a BSL-3 is, this is what a BSL-4 is, this is what a BSL-2 is, and what are necessarily those building standards, but also buildings age. You need to replace infrastructure. Where is your funding associated with that? What do you have access to? But also at the same point in time, do you necessarily need all of the bells and whistles? That's, a question that many of us have. I mean, during the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015, there were researchers working with positive blood samples behind plexiglasses and wearing a respirator. They were not inside of a BSL-4, and they didn't get sick, right? So just really thinking about, what do facilities look like? What do you need? And all of this stuff varies because, in the United States, these facilities cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but other countries can't afford that. Other countries, you could build it, but are they going to be able to maintain the infrastructure? But also, do you actually need that? One of the things that we're seeing post-COVID is that more and more countries want to be able to fend for themselves, which more power to them. Completely agree. They don't want to be reliant on the United States or China or Canada or the UK to provide them vaccines. They want to be able to do the research and they want to be able to develop therapeutics themselves. So we're definitely seeing a proliferation and being built of a lot more high containment laboratories around the world in areas where they weren't necessarily present before. But also the diversity and complexity of our practices and our procedures. A lot of our practices and procedures are very dependent upon the work that our researchers are doing, which absolutely varies from institution to institution, as well as the facilities they work in. Combine those two things together, there isn't always a standard way to do things. And it makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more complex and a lot more of a gray area associated with that. But then also administration, organizational structure. Most people don't necessarily think about this, really does impact how well a biosafety program functions at an institution. Does that biosafety program have teeth? Does that biosafety program have the support of leadership to do what needs to be done in a specific situation? Is it actually viewed as a collaborative relationship between the researchers, or is it more associated with compliance police, so to speak, as kind of a different way to describe it? What does that relationship look like? What does that support look like? And that will very much depend upon the ability and the effectiveness of an institution's biosafety program. Another thing is that this isn't predictable, right? We have researchers come to us that are like, oh, we'd like to do this, or we'd like to do this, or we have an outbreak somewhere, or we have an epidemic or a pandemic. Outbreaks and pandemics are increasingly driving research programs. And we have to be nimble and we have to be flexible and we have to figure out how to mitigate real risk versus perceived risk. And what information do we have when someone is working with a novel pathogen? When the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, pandemic started, the world changed at a point in time, but many biosafety professionals, their world changed much earlier because our researchers were coming to us saying, hey, we need to work with this virus. We need to understand what it looks like. And we didn't know what it was capable of. So we used models that we knew, SARS-CoV-1 or influenza virus, to figure out, okay, what actually needs to be in place to support this research? What risk mitigation measures do we need? On the flip side, things happen. There is no such thing as zero risk in research. And it's our job to mitigate that, mitigate as much risk as possible, and then figure out PPE practices or whatever that can be used to kind of fill necessarily that gap. But there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily expect. And we have to figure out in real time about how are we going to handle that. And again, it goes back to this concept of real risk versus perceived risk. And then also we all know that, diseases don't know any borders. So figuring out, again, how we can contribute and can be a positive influence with researchers to help them do their important research as quickly as possible. Biosafety is also growing. In the last decade, we have seen a lot more professional associations or groups associated with biosafety or biosecurity increasing, which is absolutely fantastic. There's networks being built, there's information being shared, and it's incredibly important to have a resource. I think many of us inside the field, we learn a lot and we rely a lot on our colleagues and our networks and people that we can ask, hey, have you ever seen this before? What have you done this before? Anybody ever work with this agent or had this question before? I think it's incredibly useful to have a network of colleagues that you can reach out to and can provide you support and bounce ideas off of if you're dealing with something you really haven't dealt with before. I think it's also really important for us to talk about, to talk a little bit more about outbreaks and pandemics and how that pushes research. It pushes research in two ways. You have the human want to be able to contribute and help to a situation, but then you also have funding pushes. Oftentimes when you have outbreaks or pandemics, there is a lot more funding associated with doing research in those areas. So that will push researchers to those various areas to add new aspects to their research program. And this is just a snapshot of a variety of different more high-profile outbreaks since the early 2000s. We had the original SARS-CoV-1 outbreak. I remember where I was. I was an undergrad, and I remember I saw a crawler go across the bottom of CNN, and I was like, "What? An outbreak? What?" And I made my dad sit there and watch until the trailer came back, so that I could actually see what was going on and what was being talked about. Then in 2009, you had the H1N1 seasonal influenza. Well, it's now seasonal, but the pandemic. I was working in an influenza lab at the time, and I remember the chaos of, the original numbers coming out of Mexico, trying to get samples, trying to get research started so that we could understand the capability of what that virus was. The lab that I was specifically working in, we got the virus in, and 1 month later, there was a paper that went to Nature. There was a whole team of researchers that dropped everything that they were doing to try and understand what this virus was actually capable of. We've had chikungunya outbreaks. We've had the 2014, 2015 Ebola outbreak, which far exceeded anybody's expectations of, or not expectations, but thoughts of what Ebola could necessarily do from an outbreak situation. But we saw lots of money being given to infectious disease units at hospitals, clinical diagnostic labs, to be able to support, detect, and be prepared for that type of outbreak. But yet that money dried up and went away. And one of the things that was actually funded was biosafety professionals to work and support clinical diagnostic laboratories inside the United States. And we forgot a lot of that information by the time the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic started in 2020. We've also had outbreaks afterwards with monkeypox. We've seen the reemergence of polio in a variety of different situations. Measles is becoming a big thing again. Like I just saw earlier this week that there were 2 potential exposure situations at Dulles Airport and Reagan in Washington, D.C. About a month ago here, we had a potential situation in Denver where there was a person that went through the Denver International Airport with measles. We've seen multiple different outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza, and those outbreaks are changing. For a long time, it was very stable. It was highly pathogenic H5N1, and now we're seeing a large variety of different things, and it's not different virus types, and it's not staying the same. So how can we contribute to better response? How can we contribute to supporting poultry farms and other places that are being affected by these outbreaks? We've had Nipah outbreaks, we've had Marburg. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think one of the things that just really resonates me with a biosafety professional, as when I was in one of my microbiology lectures back in undergrad, the faculty member said, we can only culture 0.1% of the microorganisms out there. You think about everything we know about, and if that's really only 0.1%, there is so much more. So how can we be nimble as a profession? How can we continue to support research that is forward thinking in regards to pandemic preparedness, understanding how these agents do what they do? There's also been a push inside of the United States to strengthen biosafety as a whole. So there, in September of 2020, it was announced that there was going to be an executive order on advancing biotechnology, biomanufacturing innovation for a sustainable, safe, and secure American bioeconomy. Specifically inside that executive order, it says we must take concrete steps to reduce biological risks associated with advances in biotechnology. We need to invest in and promote biosafety and biosecurity to ensure that biotechnology is developed and deployed in ways that align with the United States principles, values, and international best practices. In addition, we must safeguard the United States' bioeconomy as foreign adversaries and strategic competitors alike use legal and illegal means to acquire technology and information. Now, this is really the first time that biosafety has really been heralded by the United States government as a really critical piece of supporting the bioeconomy inside of the United States. We also, as part of the National Biodefense Strategy and Implementation Plan, it specifically talks about being able to detect pandemics and other biological threats, prevent outbreaks from becoming epidemics, and prevent biological incidents before they happen, preparing for other pandemics and other biological incidents. If there is a biological incident, being able to detect and contain it. All things that, we have been talking about as as we're coming out of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, and how important biosafety is. And we've seen a lot of emphasis on things, but it's also become highly politicized. And that isn't necessarily a good thing, because we're going back to this idea of perceived risk that there's actually a problem versus actual risk. What are really our holes and what are our gaps? So WHO published about a year or two ago, I'm kind of blanking on the timeline, this responsible conduct of research document. So it really focuses on evolving challenges and gaps in the governance of biorisk management, the values and principles to guide how we should be creating frameworks, rules, guidelines to support it, as well as tools and mechanisms for creating that governance, and then also having scenarios and case studies for people to learn. So WHO is not a regulatory body. They are a supporting body. So this document, which is about over 200 pages, is really meant to provide a starting position and a goal for countries around the world to develop similar biosafety or biosecurity focused programs. So it's a more holistic biorisk management inside of each country. We're also seeing in the United States that there's a lot of conversation about potentially revising the federal select agent regulations. So for those of you that might not know what select agents have been deemed by the United States government to be potential bioterrorism threats. And it's roughly 65, 68 agents. The list kind of goes up or goes down every couple of years when they review it. And there's you have to be registered to work with these agents. You have to be registered to possess these agents. And every single thing you do has to be documented to the T. But they are talking here in the United States about expanding this list. And arguably what they're talking about right now is more about perceived risk versus real risk. And it's going to be incredibly challenging, because if you are a member of the federal select agent program, you don't get extra money in your grants. You don't get money from the government to do this research. It is an unfunded mandate, and it takes a toll on science over time. And there are many research programs that have just stopped because it is too much of a burden. And my guess is, depending upon where we go and how we revise things, there could be a similar instance of more entities and more research programs stopping just because enough is enough. Also, in the United States, we have multiple different policies dealing with dual-use research of concern, or legitimate research that could be used for nefarious purposes, as well as working with pathogens of pandemic potential and mutating them or altering them. Again, post-COVID, there has been a lot of conversation about whether these policies are adequate and more things need to be added. So within the next few weeks, rumor has it that the United States government is going to officially announce changes to these policies. Most likely they are going to be expanded, and they are going to include more things, which means there's more work institutions have to do if they work in these specific areas. So it'll be interesting to see again whether or not this is more reactionary of perceived risk versus real risk. My guess is it's going to be more along the perceived line, and not necessarily going as far as we need to go to really mitigate the real risks associated with this type of research. Now, combine all of these things. We've got research that could be misused, an increased focus on biosecurity and cybersecurity, and we have all of these new emerging technologies. We have benchtop synthesizers. We have the ability to do gene editing. We have the ability to create viruses from, synthetically. We have so many different tools, and the tools are always moving faster than the oversight and the regulations can move. So that really falls upon the biosafety professional to try and stay as up to date with technology as possible, and to figure out where the real risks are. And one of the real questions that we're all kind of not struggling with or thinking about is, how does AI fit into this? What barriers that we have perceived to be there could be overcome because of AI? Will there be safeguards put in place by these companies for these AI tools that will allow someone not necessarily to, for the AI to connect all the dots for everybody and to really lower the barrier to making some of these technologies more capable of being misused. That's going to be it's going to be a struggle going forwards, and to figure out necessarily what that looks like. Right now, generations of AI aren't necessarily the best at doing biosecurity risk assessments, although some are better than others, and clearly they're learning from us and they're getting better and better and better. But it's going to be some very interesting challenges going forwards and what that potentially looks like. Also going forwards, what's missing? Well, one of the big things that's missing is data. We don't have a lot of data about the biosafety practices that we ask researchers to do. And that's what in the executive order talking about funding biosafety, it's talking about funding biosafety research, applied biosafety research, to understand what bells and whistles do we really need to have and we get the most bang for our buck, and what other ones are really not providing us any extra protection, for example. So I was actually part of a multi-institution team that did some applied biosafety research, and we were looking specifically at human reliability and how often do researchers make mistakes, and do they recognize when a mistake is made? And we simply we took water, we laced it with glow germ, and we asked them to pipette. And we looked for errors. And that data should be coming out soon. That's a project in collaboration with Griffin Scientific and a wide variety of other institutions around the world. So Dr. Rocco Casagrande has talked quite a bit publicly about that research. But one of the most interesting things, at least at our institution at Colorado State, was the fact that if there was an error made, it was always staying inside of the biosafety cabinet. So from our preliminary data, it really emphasized to me the importance of a biosafety cabinet and doing the work in there correctly. But there's a lot more data that we need and a lot more research that needs to be done, but the funding for that has to come somewhere. And that really leads us into financial resources, right? Like, who is going to fund some of these fundamental things so that we really have a better grasp of what we're asking researchers to do and have better buy-in from researchers, as well as having the appropriate number of biosafety professionals at an institution based upon their portfolio. We also don't have a lot of training programs. Almost all of us are taught on the job. And we have, it's real world experience. There is a certification program that's been started at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. There's a couple of other institutions that are talking about creating certification or graduate style kind of programs, but we're a long ways away from that. At Colorado State, I actually teach a 2-credit course of the fundamentals of biosafety and biosecurity, but it's not meant to make someone like me. It's meant to create a safer generation of scientists. So I teach them the fundamentals that hopefully, if they go to vet school, med school, they are a researcher in a lab, whatever they choose to do, they're better at identifying risk and mitigating risk. So it's really hopefully creating a generation of scientists that I really want to work with and have a lot of respect for biosafety and biosecurity, and it isn't necessarily a battle when you ask them to do things. Also, there is, while right now we have a lot of interest in biosafety, it's probably going to wane in the next year or two, right? When we're not so focused on pandemics anymore. But also, I think we really need to think about teaching biosafety professionals the soft skills. So much of what we do and getting buy-in from people is really sociology and psychology, and figuring out how do we get people to do what we need them to do, to buy into what we're selling, and to make sure that they're safe. And really, a lot of that comes down to understanding them as a person and understanding what drives them. And so there's a lot of these soft skills that we really haven't talked a lot about, and we really need to bring more into the profession, and figuring out how we can share that information with our colleagues. And then lastly, I just really want to highlight outreach and transparency. One of the side effects of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has been an overall lack of public trust in science, especially high containment research. And we need to be better stewards about biosafety. We need to talk about it more, because most people don't realize that these researchers aren't just doing whatever they want. There are rules, there are safeguards, and that there are people like us working with them on a daily basis. So we really need to talk more about what we do as a profession, the importance that biosafety plays in, supporting researchers, mitigating risks of the research, protecting the community and the environment. But then we also need to think about how can we be more transparent? Because transparency is key in building that public trust. How can we talk about things in a more proactive way to get more people involved, make people realize what's going on, hopefully combat a lot of the mis, dis, and malinformation that is out there, and really focus more on the benefits of science and the benefits of biosafety. And with that, that is the end of my presentation, and I want to thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. What an excellent way to round out this symposium. Before we start the Q&A segment of this talk, I do just want to quickly take this moment to remind our viewers to keep submitting their questions via the chat system to the right, and we'll address them as much as we can with the time we have left. So Rebecca, as the landscape of biosafety evolves, we're curious about your perspective on any potential regulatory or oversight changes that biosafety professionals might encounter in the future. How do you foresee these changes impacting the field?
I think it's going to take a lot more time. I mean, we don't know, especially inside the United States, we know change is coming. We don't necessarily know what it looks like. PAWPA, the Pandemic All Hazards Act, has some things in there that could affect biosafety and select agent regulations. Also, we don't have an international biosafety standard or agreement, right? And we don't have that level playing field for everybody to be starting at to mitigate risk. So there's a question of whether or not we'd ever be able to come to consensus there. But I think regardless, there's going to be more regulation. There's going to be more oversight. Probably in the United States, there's a high possibility that more high containment research could be regulated, not just the select agent piece of things. So I think it is going to require more biosafety professionals, more resources, and we're going to need more people going into this field going forwards. But we also need to figure out how to support the researchers who are doing this research to keep them doing it, because it's incredibly important, right? A lot of this weighs on them. So if there is a way that we can centralize some of these services and provide more of the support from institution to institution, hopefully we can keep more researchers doing this important work.
Thank you. So biosafety professionals navigate a complex terrain. In your experience, what would you identify as the most significant challenge they face today, and how can the industry address or overcome this challenge?
I would say there's two. One is resource constraints and getting buy-in from your leadership, and really the best way to go about that is with data and more data and more data. So APSA International has a task force that they've put together to try and develop metrics similar to what a lot of environmental health and safety departments has, to basically be like, okay, you have this breadth of research, this amount of square footage, these are the number of biosafety professionals, or these are the metrics you need to have to support your program. But really, the success I have had in that conversation has all been about data and more data, and showing the administration what the risks to the institution are. It's a pretty powerful tool. On the reverse side, we really need to think more about the other really challenging piece is what I mentioned, is getting people's buy-in. Researchers, depending upon who their mentors were, who they were trained by, their experiences with fellow safety professionals really can cloud their willingness to participate, their willingness to follow the rules. And so that sociology and psychological piece is so incredibly important in how we interact with our researchers on a daily basis, and building that trust and building that collaboration.
That's great. Moving on to your next question, transparency is crucial in ensuring public trust and understanding. How can biosafety professionals be more transparent about the process and the role they play?
That's a great question. It's usually we're in the shadows, right? Nobody, even at our institutions, necessarily realizes we're there until something happens and it kind of puts us to the forefront. But I think it really comes down to being proactive. It comes down to, doing pieces highlighting biosafety professionals, like pieces in the media, right? It's about writing articles. It's about getting out there. It's about talking about this profession. And now, mind you, not every institution equally supports their biosafety professional doing interviews or publishing manuscripts or doing opinion pieces. But that really needs to happen. And on the flip side, in support of that, APSA International and other professional associations are starting to make a real concerted effort to get out into the media more, to become more mainstream and support the profession and increase that level of transparency about what happens and what we all do.
Thank you. So researchers play a vital role in the research process. From your perspective, how can researchers contribute to increased transparency about the methods and the procedures involved in their work? What practices do you recommend for fostering openness in research?
It's a great question. My number one piece of advice is become very good friends with your science communicator at your institution. They are incredible at finding ways to communicate your research, because we are very much a social media world, right? But one false step, one whatever, you write the wrong thing on X, or you put something, kind of misphrase it on LinkedIn, and something can take on a life of its own. So I think the biggest thing is being mindful about the words you're using to describe your research. Be enthusiastic, but be mindful about who is listening and the words that you are using to describe your research. But that's where the science communicators are amazing, and they will help you and walk you through all of that.
Those are some great answers. I do have one more question for you, which you've touched on in your earlier slides on diversity and complexity of institutions in different countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm considering the historical roots in North America and Western Europe. How do biosafety practices differ in other regions globally? Are there lessons or best practices from diverse international approaches that can inform and enhance biosafety measures for labs of the future?
That's a really interesting question, because one of the biggest differences around the world is, so for example, African swine fever virus. Inside the United States, it would be catastrophic if we had a single case. It is highly, highly controlled, and there's few institutions that can work with it. But if you go to Africa, they can do experiments in cattle at animal biosafety level 2, because it's endemic there. So endemic in certain areas will alter the risk mitigation measures and the type of facility you need to do that research, depending upon where you're doing it in the world, for example. So that's one way it impacts things. Also, two is, for example, if you have a high containment facility and you don't necessarily have reliable power, what type of locks should you have? You don't necessarily want to have electronic locks, right? So you need to think a little bit more about your location, your infrastructure, what you need to actually get the research done. And that's another way things vary from country to country. There are a lot of great lessons to be learned. So the Department of State here in the United States actually has a multi-year project to meet with people at a variety of different meetings and experts around the world to develop an international applied biosafety research agenda, to understand what we know in what areas, what don't we know in what areas, and kind of compile this really large overarching research agenda. So it'll be very interesting to see, because I think there's a lot of great innovations that have happened with very little money in a variety of different countries around the world, but we don't necessarily have them collated together. So hopefully this project will gather a lot of that information, and we'll have a much better picture about best practices that can be shared.
Thank you, Rebecca. Before we wrap up, I do have just one final question to ask. If you could answer it in a few words, given the emphasis on biosafety and biosecurity, do you have any quick tips for striking the right balance between safety and security within the labs?
It's always a challenge, really. And it comes down to the end of the day, what risks are you willing to accept, and what are the potential implications of those risks? Because we can put security all day long, right? But but does it actually make sense for that research or for that facility? You're always weighing that balance of protecting your assets, protecting your researchers, but wanting to make sure research and collaboration can still happen. And that's always a balance, and it is really a case-by-case situation.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. Any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be answered offline as soon as possible. So that's it for this year's Laboratory of the Future online symposium. As mentioned throughout the day, all the talks from today's event will be made available to view on demand for the next 30 days. You can access the talks via the same link you used to access them today, and we will be sure to pass on any further questions you submit through the system to the relevant speaker. That just leaves me to say thanks again, Rebecca, and for everyone watching, we will see you again at our next online symposium, Advances in Battery Research. Goodbye.